We trust different people for different things. I'm fond of saying everybody is absolutely trustworthy to be what they are.
Whether it is really intelligent or not is distracting. The more important thing is, can it be deployed to do a particular job, and what is the social impact of that?
What humans do uniquely, not as a competitive issue though, more because I believe businesses have forgotten.
From Orion X, this is the Marketing Podcast. Marketing has transformed in significant ways. More technology, more data, more social, more blending of arts and sciences, more integrated with every other function, and ultimately more critical to the organization. Join Shaheen Khan and Doug Garnett as they discuss news and happenings in the world of marketing, from the boardroom to customer programs.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Marketing Podcast, although we talk about a lot of other things too these days. I'm Shaheen Khan, and with me is Doug Garnett, as usual. How are you doing, Doug?
I'm doing well. Besides, spring has sprung, so that always makes things better.
Spring in the beautiful Northwest.
Yeah, it's really nice.
So without further ado, what is the cartoon of the week?
Well, the tune of the week comes from one Paul Noth, and it shows a bunch of pirates inside their ship looking at what would be maps. And the main pirate says, "We have too few treasure maps and far too many org charts."
Right.
And they have an org chart unrolled. I love the idea of the grumpy pirate going, "Why do we have these org charts?"
So funny, if that's the word enough. I did not even notice that they were pirates. So I missed a big angle of this thing, but I did think about, org charts. So
yes. Well, my first thought was actually I remembered back to a story about Henry Ford Sr. That Ford had grown to over 100,000 employees. And on the other hand, Ford was getting more and more fully disorganized and discombobulated because Henry Ford would fire anyone he saw with an org chart. And his belief was that any executive looking at org charts was far too worried about their own position in the company.
I see.
Than about making things run well. So
Yeah. Well,
I actually think Ford has a point. On the other hand, 100,000 people are really hard to run if you don't know where they live, or exist, or communicate.
Well, multiple thoughts, but just to kind of talk about Ford, I think that every CEO has a model that seems to work for them, and it sort of works until it doesn't. And when it doesn't, they get criticized and all of that. But as long as they're going from strength to strength, they get lauded and they get put up as an example of what everybody else should be doing as well, which no such thing. Just because it works for that person doesn't mean it's going to work for you. And it could sometimes be that they're successful despite that, not because of it. There's a lot of cases like that as well. So I think we need to remember that these organizational models that are unusual may actually not be a great idea for you. And they may not even be a great idea for the person practicing it, but hey, they're successful and more power to them, kind of a thing.
Well, I think with Ford, what happened is once Henry Ford Jr., the younger, his grandson took over. Apparently, Ford almost went bankrupt in World War because of its intense disorganization at that time. That led to, if you've ever heard the story of the Whiz Kids, you can go look it up. But that led Ford to bring in the Whiz Kids to try to get organized. Once they did, it did wonderful things for Ford. But
Right.
They actually had a period of time when it was a little bit dicey, apparently.
Yeah. The other thing the cartoon reminded me of was this Harvard Business Review article of 1993, which you kindly and deftly found online. And my recollection was that there was an administrative org chart, org structure. There was a business process org chart, like how things get done actually, and not kind of functionally, but like across the company. And then relationship trust organization, where people know and trust each other, or go on lunchtime walks together, or kids go to the same school together, sort of a thing. That is an informal thing on the side. And it was funny that after you found the article actually said something else, not that different, but it was a little different. So it was like interesting that my recollection of the article was close, but not exact.
Well, I find that I do that all the time. And then I go back and look at something and realize, well, it didn't exactly say that. And I think it's okay because our minds play with it. I'll suggest you found a way to look at it that actually worked pretty well for you. So,
You're right, because sometimes, yeah, that's great, but I kind of like mine better.
Yeah.
So the article talked about levels, and
Mhm.
the org chart says who's on top, etc. And then they talked about an advice network
Mhm.
that would recognize expertise, I think,
Yeah.
in their context. And then they did have the trust network,
Mhm.
as I had recalled as well. So it was like, 2.5 out of 3, I would
Yeah.
say.
Well, I think it's an interesting way to look at companies because org charts get us distracted, and sometimes they get us distracted from achieving big things. They also ignore things like the advice network, which is who do people rely on for answers?
Right.
And they also ignore how that may or may not match up with a trust network. Who do I trust to talk about? In the article, they mentioned talking about the politics. Who do I trust to talk about what's going on politically? And
Yeah,
that can
well,
be somebody different from advice on how do I solve this problem with the work. How do I solve this problem politically is a different question.
yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
I think it's actually pretty fascinating to look at that. In my writing on complexity, I've talked about these layers of webs, and it's almost like there are these different layers and there's interaction between the layers, but you kind of look, well, there's a formal layer, and then there's this trust layer, and then there's, maybe an advice layer, and then there's a whose kids play with whose kids layer. Those things matter.
That's absolutely right.
You know,
Yeah, yeah.
the best informal communication I saw was at General Dynamics, where there was a guy I sat right next to who was a director and a budget director, and he held daily bridge games. So much work got done around those daily bridge games. It's just incredible how much was achieved because these guys were all standing around, and somebody would say, by the way, did you read that 4714 on the Atlas ring defect? And then, the stuff would happen. It would happen
Interesting.
just hanging out, eating lunch, and watching somebody play bridge, and no meetings involved. And a lot of good
Interesting.
stuff happened.
Yeah. So, and then if you map this to computer system architecture, which I do many times
Mm-hmm.
because the parallels are interesting to me and sometimes
Mm-hmm.
even illuminating.
Mm-hmm.
As we have digitized our life,
Mm-hmm.
it is very clear that there are just a bunch of computers connected to each other, small, medium, large, big supercomputers from your phone or the sensor that opens the door with a badge reader.
Mm-hmm.
And you could envision that company and organization is got a digital twin, as the parlance has these days. And that digital twin is essentially a fabric
Mm-hmm.
that connects these computers together. And then what flows through this fabric is a workflow that gets the tasks done properly, and data flow, the data that goes from place to place or gets stored, place. And then the fabric is not limited to the organization because it's got connections to customers and suppliers and influencers and such. So you could sort of envision that this web of webs, as you put it, is like emerging as a digital representation of a company.
Well, and interestingly, out of complexity, one of the key things is the nodes matter, but what passes on the connections between them is most important.
Right.
And in fact, it's interesting. I've written a little bit about how we get caught up in nouns in business. But the minute you turn things into nouns, you forget that they're active and something's always passing around. And so when I look at one of these pictures of the advice network, for example, there's constant flow going on. So that it's
Right.
not a static thing. It's an active thing where the flow matters. And out of complexity, what you find is it's those interrelations, that what passes amongst the nodes is what leads things to emerge. So it is an emergent, with a whole, in a sense, the result of the company emerges from out of all these interconnected sets of things.
Right on. Right on. So you look at that and then you say, okay, what does the workflow and data flow look like in the human network that represents the organization? And then some of what we read in this article kind of show up as well.
Well, it was interesting. The article, as it goes on, talks about the CEO misunderstanding, for example, the trust network. He had a guy that he had promoted that he thought he promoted because the guy was core to the trust network, but it turned out he was core to the advice network.
I
But
see.
he was kind of a hard ass and people didn't really trust him. And so there was this gap, and the gap was ending up hurting their business. And once these advisors helped him see that, they were able to kind of change what was going on and support the guy as well. And they ended up with a slight adjustment in the organization, and everything worked a lot better by seeing that he had the advice but not the trust.
Yeah.
And that was interesting.
So maybe that's why I like mine better, because I think if you have advice, maybe that even is why I kind of was thinking business process instead of advice, because it's really hard to seek someone's advice without trusting them.
Right.
So now you're really talking about a different kind of trust for expertise and trust for confidence or confiding in someone. And maybe that's what the article is trying to capture. But I believe that might be the problem. And I think the way business gets done is more of a org that you could represent and say that is the business process workflow.
Well, and I think, or maybe they need a fourth one, that there's certain, you're right, because trust varies. We trust different people for different things. I'm fond of saying everybody is absolutely trustworthy to be what they are. And if they're a jerk, they're absolutely trustworthy to be a jerk, And so there's people you can absolutely trust to give you straight shooting advice, but you may not want to trust them with other kinds of things. Trust is something we make really careful, I think, distinctions about when we're being wise.
Yeah. So this definition incorporates predictability in some ways.
Well, the predictability of what you might get back from the person. Yeah, because actually, and trust, we need that especially because trust means we're allowing ourselves to be somewhat vulnerable. And, we're not likely to want to be vulnerable unless we believe we can trust that person to treat that vulnerability well. I have found times when I have confided in somebody, nothing terribly personal, but maybe about business. And there was one guy I did that with where what I discovered is he would then come to kind of take ownership for that business. Well, that's not what I was after. I was just after a little bit of advice.
I
So
see.
I wanted his thoughts. But then from that point on, he would keep coming back as if he had ownership of it. And, so I ended up stopping that practice with him because I learned that I couldn't trust him to just simply give back some quick thoughts, which is what I really needed.
Yeah.
Actually, I think trust is a multiplier. We don't talk about it enough in business about the value of fundamental trust within an operation. But, once you work with a team and you know how everybody works and you know how to trust everybody, man, teams can become extraordinarily powerful because you can stop worrying about this person and, in that job and you know what to give them and all these things. And it's a multiplier for our efforts. But, kind of the fundamental managerial approach is that that's kind of too personal. We can't talk about that in business.
Well, that's very true. The other part of these organizational structures is, in fact, what topics you talked about, like who can you trust to have like a political discussion with? Well, as of the past couple of few decades, it's like nobody. Because you can't, it's like, religion, politics,
right.
Other matters like that are just too sensitive and too prone to be misunderstood, even if you don't mean it in a bad way. And like a lot worse if somebody does mean it. So people get trained to just stay away from it. And that makes it difficult to establish that level of intimate trust. Everybody talks about how we are a family in a company, right?
Right.
And maybe your heart's in the right place, but there are still topics that you can't go towards because it's too sensitive. Yeah.
Well, and honestly, I think we're better off not to be families in a company. We're a company. We're all there to try to do something together and make things work. My own sense is I've never been real fond of the family idea just because I sure hate getting into a position if I have to, I need to lay somebody off. That's not very family-like.
Yeah, it certainly sets expectations that may not be sustainable.
Yeah, we can't live up to them as managers.
But I think in the sense that you're saying opinions are sought, we will make sure that everybody is heard. Some of these good practices.
Well, in practices like we don't punish the messenger, things like that. I mean, fundamental basics of, don't shoot the messenger and things like that. Hey, I wanted to go back to the org chart idea, back to the original cartoon with the pirates, because the other thought I had is I'm actually writing about the process of exploring to discover radically new things for business. I mean, if you need a big jump in revenue at some point, it doesn't happen instantly. You have to figure out how you explore to figure that out. And one of the things that happens is that when you're exploring issues like that, I think traditional managerial approaches, best practices, metric programs, firm absolute goals actually impede our ability to discover important new things more than they help. And in my writing, and an issue that comes out of complexity and study of natural systems is that natural systems, some portion are always exploiting what's already known in that system. And some portion of that system spends time exploring new things so the system's healthy when maybe the stuff that they're exploring runs out. So Rory Sutherland talks about bees, and that there's this waggle dance that tells worker bees what to do. But there's a percentage, maybe 20% of worker bees, that always ignore the waggle dance and go off and do whatever they damn well want to anyway. And the hive is only healthy because both exist, right? And so I look at the pirates and I say, these pirates are off exploring. Org charts really aren't part of the exploration work. So I think that was a long-winded way to get around to that punchline for the pirates.
That's very good. All right. So the other topic that has been floating around is the impact of AI on everything, but especially on search, because a lot of us are using it just as a more refined, more processed search.
Sounds good. And it popped up from my radar. My brother Stan sent me an article titled, "Is Google at Risk of Becoming Irrelevant?" And the subtitle is "Alphabet's Stock Drop Draws Comparison to Kodak." And of course, I've looked at Kodak quite a bit, and I was writing on it this afternoon. So this kind of hit all my buttons for what's going on. I don't know that the Kodak comparison is really worth talking about very much, but I do think the issue for Google is one that is it's a serious question here about what the effect of AI is going to be. And essentially, if people do their searches through a Chat GPT or a Claude, if they're in higher ed or any of these other systems, Google loses quite a bit of revenue potentially through them. And so there is a valid threat. And it's interesting to me partly because I've always known every company, Apple, Google, Amazon, they're not forever. Companies don't last forever. And so there always can be a threat that comes up. So I was a little surprised to see this one and think, oh, maybe that is Google's existential threat. I don't know.
Yeah, when ChatGPT first came out and it showed that it knows everything, of course, it's ingested everything and can summarize it and can string things together, etc. So it was very clear that it is going to replace a portion of search traffic. So for those of us who spend non-trivial dollars on digital ads, you sort of immediately start thinking about, well, if my audience is using AI instead of traditional search, can I even reach them? In what way are you going to incorporate ads into AI responses? Then that leads you down the path of how do you avoid biased AI results because they are motivated by ads? Is that what's going to be? Or are you just going to insert a little bit of an ad and like, how's that going to pan out? But the idea that the Google business model is under threat was immediately apparent. Even before AI, the fact that there are multiple search engines and Bing was starting to do better, and then you go to other countries and there might be indigenous search engines that are preferred, that was already part of the whole dynamics.
I think to some degree, I have real mixed feelings about the Kodak analogy, but one of the things that does strike me as similar is about 75% of Google's revenue depends fundamentally on search. And that's a lot. And that was part of Kodak's brittleness, is that despite attempts to diversify, they never reached a point where their revenues diversified enough. And so Fujifilm survived because their revenues were about 30% based on film. Kodak remained at about 70 to 80% based on film. And finding a new industry with $7 billion in Kodak revenues was impossible. In this case, Google is looking at 70 some billion, and it would be very hard if that disappears. But there's a flip side to that I keep thinking about, which is what Kodak didn't have is a whole bunch of companies spending 72 billion who need value for their 72 billion. So that immediately kind of makes the situation murkier than Kodak, because Kodak didn't have that. I mean, people didn't really care. Once they didn't need film, they were happy not to buy it and not buy the digital services and just use their iPhone. And, it all kind of makes sense. But I think that there is an issue here for Google. Is different because there's this question of advertisers needing the value they get from that spending.
But that is contingent on end users actually using Google to look for products that they would like to buy, because Google nailed that. It turns out people do search for things that they are going to buy, and then you can tap into that. But they also have a commanding lead in ad platforms, all the different software pieces that work together. So they've got that ecosystem down really well, and others need to build that in order to actually compete with them on those dollars. But all of it is a function of what actual consumers are doing. And Google has its own AI, and they've added that as a summary. If you ask a question, it kind of shows up. So they're like easing their way into that while figuring out how to insert ads into that part of the business. So there was an exchange on this on LinkedIn with Bruce Clark. And my take was that it is prudent to track that. But right now, at least in most of the Western geographies, that's not in threat. All the studies that I've looked at continue to say that Google Ads are still a very prominent piece of the puzzle there, and they will remain that way. But relevant to that is, how do you show up in AI answers? So the SEO is like yielding to what I kind of half jokingly called AIO, and Bruce said maybe it's AI-AIO.
Is this being created by Old MacDonald? Is that where we are?
Right. Right. So maybe that's more of a immediate task for marketing professionals than replacement of Google.
I'm sure that OpenAI is out there scrambling rapidly, wanting to get that revenue, because OpenAI has a fundamental problem that after all this, none of us are certain whether there's any way for them to make money off this miracle drug that they've created. And, certainly there's stuff out there, but Facebook, Google, and Amazon now is heavily dependent on advertising. For all the digital promises in the 2000s that there was this beautiful new Eden digitally where ads would never reach, the internet funds itself based on advertising. So
Right
I think I'm assuming OpenAI would really love to get that revenue. Whether they can find a practical, useful way to do that, we don't know.
Yeah. It's actually hard for me to tell these big AI players, OpenAI being the most prominent, whether they are trying to build a business serving consumers or the enterprise, or are they just pursuing so-called AGI? Because if that's what they're doing, then the objective really isn't revenue. The objective is, I've got AGI and you don't, and I got there first.
That's true. Yeah.
And you act differently if that's your objective. And they sure look like they're acting that way. They're like going for it, big system after big system. They are quite okay if their revenue is short of their costs, because I think they're just pursuing a different goal.
I could see that. I think I would offer them some caution, because we were just talking about trust and how critical trust is, for example, within a company. And what AI can't do is develop human trust, know how to do it, know how to pick people to trust. And maybe they could make a knockoff of it. They could probably knock off something they called it's trust-like. But as we always know with these systems, it's not really trust, AGI, is it really general intelligence, or is it fancier machine learning? And I think I suspect that you're right. They're off there. There's a lot of sci-fi language going around in AI about how good it is. We've seen the Tesla Cybertruck inventor scrambling around Washington, D.C., claiming that he can use AI to replace all the people that work at Social Security. And we know that that would be disastrous. I think, what was your comment? They might deliver 90% of what's needed. But to my mind, that last 10% is what is the difference between Social Security working and not working.
I think that's the difference between a private enterprise and a government service that's supposed to meet certain minimum requirements. But also, as you know, I think AI is about increasingly sophisticated automation. Whether it is intelligent or not, or whether it trusts or not, doesn't really matter. Because if you can actually perform a task better than most people, more specifically better than me, then it's like, yeah, good enough. We're going to be using it. But then it's also not without cost.
Here's an interesting thought for you. It's been striking me, which is, if search really is where it has its strongest mass market appeal, what it's doing in search is what computers have always done. As humans, we're not very good at going through masses and masses and masses of data to pick out the 5 things that matter. And so it's really nice as a human to Google, would you go do that for me? Or ChatGPT, would you go do that for me a little more sophisticatedly? And that makes sense. That's what tech has always done.
Yep, automation.
And take things that humans, we used to think that chess was the ultimate human ability, because in fact, as humans, looking at other humans, those few who could keep in their brain how to win a chess game were kind of like they had magic. But eventually what we found out is that was a fairly knockoffable human ability. That human abilities have more to do with perception and insight and surprise and so that it could search well. I'd go back to what was that? It's the old movie where Katharine Hepburn's a librarian and a computer gets brought in to replace her and she has a little competition with it. And it's from the 60s. It's a brilliant movie. And we almost haven't changed. It's still Google and ChatGPT versus human intuition doing a search. And what's the right way?
Yeah. Well, ultimately, I see it as automation.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And if you think of it that way, then if it can be defined, it can be automated. So chess, very specific rules. It can be very precisely defined. And in due course, you could automate it, and people have. But even that, there was a case recently where the chess program wasn't able to see something that a human did see. But then that was a really edge condition sort of a thing. And of course, the first time that happens, it's going to see it from then on. So it's cumulative, and it becomes like a slow flood that keeps rising and gets better and better until it gets better than me. And that may not take a long time, and then it's kind of done, right? And that's, I think, part of what we're observing with AI. So I think the discussion of whether it is really intelligent or not is in a way kind of distracting. The more important thing is, can it be deployed to do a particular job, and what is the social impact of that?
The Complexity podcast that the Santa Fe Institute puts out last fall did a whole series about AI because it was hosted by Melanie Mitchell because that's her specialty. One of the really intriguing discussions in there was one of their experts was talking about how everywhere that AI is succeeding, it's succeeding because other things are coming in and working along with it. And it's the combination of what it does with these other things. Like it's a little parasitical almost. It latches onto the host and together they do this thing. But they suggested it wasn't just the AI on its own doing that. It was plus, and I'm inventing this, B-tree search methods. And that combination makes it really effective kind of thing. And that was the implication in it. I don't know enough of the details, but I thought it was a pretty interesting.
Well, I'm going to comment on it, and then you can have the last word and we can wrap. I don't like formulations like that because there's an implicit attempt to make humans compete with computers. There's an implicit, maybe not so implicit, that what can you do that computers cannot do? And I just think that sets it up so that you're competing with the computer. And I'm like saying, no, we should not even be competing with computers, just like we don't compete with cars. Nobody says, well, what can you do that a car can't do?
Can you run faster than the car?
And you can't run faster. So, what value do you have? Like, you're done. And I think that's, as a human species, I'm saying that's a positioning of humans that I reject. So now, if you then ask me, well, then what is your value compared to the machine? I say my value is that I'm a human, end of story. It is sufficient to be human to have value. Our value should not come from because we can do something that machines can't do.
I don't disagree with that at all. I will say I am writing a bit right now trying to articulate more of what humans do uniquely, not as a competitive issue, though. More because I believe businesses have forgotten. Back in the 1980s, Edwards Deming wrote that the biggest waste in America is the waste of human ingenuity. And I think that businesses today are set up ignoring that humanity and the humans that work for them are a tremendous asset, and that businesses lose what that asset can bring. And right now, if in business, it's a problem because we're getting all these, we won't even need humans once we have AI. Kind of stuff. So I think maybe, to me, it feels like there's some value in saying, okay, what are those really unusual things that humans do? On the other hand, I think you're absolutely right. If it's a competition between humans and computers, to some degree, humans created a computer, okay?
Yes. Yes. Okay, so we wrap here. We're going to have to come back to this topic because it's a little bit endless and it's also very important in our time. So we should do that.
It won't go away, so we'll be back.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you all for listening. See you again next time. Really appreciate you being here. Take care.
Thank you, Shaheen. Bye now.
That's it for this episode of the Marketing Podcast. Every episode is posted on orionx.net and shared on social media. Use the comments section or tweet us with any questions or to propose topics. If you like the show, rate and review it on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. The Marketing Podcast is a production of Orion X. Thank you for listening.